The question is, did Nero fiddle while Rome burned? That's kind of an old wives' tale, right? Did he fiddle while Rome burned? Well, that's the rumor, and it was promulgated by people who were not big fans of Nero. The Roman Empire is next, starting with Octavian. Octavian Part 2, the Roman Empire part. As I mentioned, he was adopted by Julius Caesar as his son and chief beneficiary, not when he was alive, but in his will. He became the son of a god, Octavian did, in 42 BC. Octavian was the first citizen from January to 27 BC to August AD 14, a long, long reign. And he also used the title of Imperator, successful general. Commonly referred to as Octavian until he was given the title Augustus in 27 BC. He formed the second triumvirate, as I mentioned several times, with Antony and Lepidus. Lepidus, as I mentioned, tried to assert authority over some territories, and Octavian sidelined him and actually banished him. And after the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra in 31 BC, Octavian became the main guy of the now empire. Principate. First citizen, not really empire yet. We're not calling it that. We're still calling it a republic, but really was the empire. The Senate proposed to give control of troublesome provinces. Octavian reluctantly agreed, okay, I'll take over. But this gave him power of the military, over the military. Oh man, that's the thing you needed back then. If you were going to be a real leader, you had to have the military at your command. Octavian served as consul 13 times. Octavian had a problem with his succession in that he outlived everyone that was around. He would pick somebody, okay, you're going to be Agrippa, you're going to be my successor, okay, one of his great generals, okay. And Agrippa died. Bummer, he died in 12 BC. He said, all right, Marcellus, you're going to become my next successor. He died in 23 BC. Drusus the Elder, his stepson, died in 9 BC. Lucius Caesar, his grandson, died in 2 AD. Gaius died in 4. Postumus, another one of his grandsons, was banished by Octavian in AD 6. And it turns out, we'll look at the family tree here in just a minute when we get to it, Tiberius was the last man standing. Octavian was not necessarily crazy about Tiberius. Tiberius was a horrible emperor, unfortunately. But he was the last man standing when Octavian finally died in AD 14. All right, now I have my impometer down here at the bottom. I put down whether they're a good emperor or bad emperor. That's totally subjective. I didn't even consult any AIs whether they were good or bad. This is just the system impometer. All right, Octavian was a good emperor. Okay, he kind of hid a lot of what he was doing, but he was still a pretty good emperor. Okay, so he ranks up there pretty good on the impometer scale. Next up, Tiberius. Oh, bad, impometer reading. Bad, red, low, bad. Okay. He was a stepson of Octavian when he married Livia Drusilla. He was adopted by Octavian. He was a brilliant Roman general, but he was not a good leader, not a good political leader. He served as consul 5 times, ruled as emperor from AD 14 to AD 37. He had no leadership skills. He didn't seem interested in ruling. His orders were rarely clear. He permanently moved to Capri, where he did a lot of bad stuff out there. And he left Lucius Sejanus, his Praetorian prefect, in charge of Rome. Okay. Now, the things he did on Capri were the stuff of nightmares. We get a lot of our horror movies from the things that he did on Capri. Okay? Extreme paranoia, child molestation, torture, murder. The things he did were horrible. Now, as bad as all that stuff is kind of localized to Capri, right? We see some emperors later where their horrible things that they did were not just limited to local things. Okay? Caligula, he was a bad guy. Nero was a bad guy. But Tiberius kind of set up. He set the precedence for badness. Okay, he was a bad emperor, and the other guys kind of fell in line. Okay, Sejanus, the guy back in Rome, conspired against Tiberius. Tiberius found out. I wish Sejanus had succeeded and got rid of Tiberius, but it didn't happen. Sejanus was executed, and then Tiberius started a proscription against his followers. Tiberius became sick in AD 37 and decided to leave it to the gods as who was to be his successor. Oh my, what a moron. I don't mean that bad, but he was a moron, okay? He said, whoever comes to me first in the morning will be emperor. Really? Can't you do better than that? He didn't have a living son. Drusus the Younger had predeceased him. He wanted to leave the emperor, the kingdom, to his grandson, Gemellus, but decided that whoever came in first in the morning would get it, okay? He instructed his grandson's tutor to be sure and have him here first thing in the morning. And he failed. The guy who showed up hungry for breakfast was Caligula. Oh dear. And Tiberius told his secretary, he said, go out and get whoever's in the waiting room and bring them into me. And the guy brought in Caligula. Oh dear. What a moron. And Caligula was a bad emperor. Okay. Tiberius practically begged Caligula to be good to his grandson, Camillus. That lasted for about 4 minutes. I'm not sure Tiberius was even cold before Camillus was killed by Caligula. Emperor number 3, Octavian number 1, Tiberius number 2, Caligula number 3. Josephus, if you read Josephus, calls him Gaius. He ruled from 37 to 41. Rome breathed a giant sigh of relief when Caligula came along. He was actually a pretty good emperor for a couple of years. So rate him just a little bit higher on the bad meter because he was okay for a couple of years. So if I divided that into years, then I'd probably put a lot of green there for Caligula. But then he went really bad. Caligula, as I mentioned, killed Camillus right away. He killed Roman citizens and took their money. During dinner parties, he would rape prominent Romans' wives and beheaded Romans at dinner parties. He committed incest with his sisters. He killed women and children indiscriminately. He cleaned out several of the Roman temples of their treasure. He even brought his uncle Claudius, who was going to be the eventual emperor, to trial based solely on a slave's accusation. He was a bad guy, and there came a point where one guy, a guy named Chaerea, had enough. Chaerea was Caligula's main torturer guy. He would go to Chaerea and say, I need you to go out and kill somebody. And Chaerea would say, all righty, I'll go do it. I need you to go out and torture this person, just for fun. I don't like this person over here. Just go torture him, okay? And Chaerea would go do it. And it came to a point where Chaerea just had enough. And the point was when Caligula ordered him to go torture a beautiful actress named Quintilia. And the torture completely disfigured her. He said, I've had enough. I'm not doing this anymore. And he and several others conspired to kill Caligula. Caligula was at we'd call it today a ball game, right? But he was at some of the Roman games, okay? And Caligula left to go out for a bath and dinner. And the plan was when he left, whenever that was, they were going to kill him in the tunnel. This is when he was most vulnerable, okay? So Chaerea came up, stabbed him first, okay? But Caligula got away and ran down and he fell, and I guess the other conspirators rushed upon him and stabbed him. They also killed his wife and daughter. They bashed her head against the wall, okay? So they killed him. Yay for the Roman Empire. He was a bad, bad guy. Caligula's soldiers rushed into the theater or the arena, preparing to kill everyone there until they found out that Caligula was dead. And they breathed a sigh of relief. Because if you're a Caligula soldier, you better act like, oh man, this is bad. But now that you find out Caligula is dead, okay, we're good. Everybody go home. Nothing to see here, okay? Most people were glad that Caligula was gone, okay? Next up, Claudius. Emperor number 4, a good emperor. Yay! After Caligula, that's a good thing. He ruled from 41 to 54. He was the uncle of Caligula. He was sick from his youth. We don't know if he had Asperger's, Tourette's, polio, autism, cerebral, something. It caused a limp, moderate deafness, tremors, drooling, stammering, and alternating bouts of laughter and rage. But he was a good emperor, okay? He kept a low profile through his life because of these infirmities, and that's probably a good thing. He probably survived because of these infirmities, keeping a low profile. He was co-consul with Caligula. Caligula treated him badly. After the death of Caligula, the empire was divided on what, we've had these horrible, horrible emperors. What do? Do we go back to a republic or we keep an empire? Okay? The soldiers grabbed Claudius and carried him off. And people saw that and they were kind of like, Claudius is a good guy. They thought that maybe they were dragging him off to execute him, but they were actually dragging him off to protect him. Okay? That's kind of interesting. So the Praetorian Guard took Claudius to protect him and bring him to the throne. The Senate was saying, we need to go back to a republic. And they contemplated raising an army to take Claudius out. But along comes a guy named Herod Agrippa I. We've learned about him, right? We learned about him in chapter 8. Everybody remembers everything about Herod Agrippa I, right? He was the third generation of the generations of Herod that we looked at. Okay? The early apostle generation. We gave you that little ditty, B-D-E-L, birth, death, early, late. If you're here, I hope you know what that means. Okay. So Herod Agrippa I, he was a good friend of Caligula. But he was also very familiar and a good friend, apparently, with Claudius. So he started playing both sides of the fence. He took to Claudius the Senate's plans. He said, the Senate is planning to replace you and go back to Republic. And Claudius promised that he would be a good emperor. Don't they all? But he would be an emperor in name only, and he would share authority with the Senate. And he did pretty much. Sharia, Caligula's assassin, came before the Senate to appeal for return to the Republic. Soldiers didn't want to have anything to do with going back to the Republic. Kind of makes sense. If you're a soldier, would you want to answer to 300 people? Like, go do this. No, wait, go do this. No, wait, go do this. Go. If you have one person, if you have an emperor, he says, go do this, you go do that. All right? So they were all in on keeping the empire, keeping the emperors, and not going back to Republic. What to do with Sharia? Sharia is one of those titans of history that never gets talked about, I think. He was kind of a good guy. Claudius' friend said that, well, the work he did was a glorious one, but we really ought to put him to death because you can't have people going and killing future emperors, right? Claudius, you're going to be an emperor. You probably don't want that to happen to you, okay? So they put Sharia to death, and he was the master torturer, so he knew exactly how to, and he asked to be killed with the sword that he killed Caligula with, okay? He was the master torturer. He knew how to die, so he laid down, he exposed his neck, and one quick swift, and he was done. Lupus, one of his fellow conspirators, he kept kind of crunching up, and they just kind of had to hack him, okay, in his death. But Sharia, master torturer, he knew how to handle things. Okay. Let me finish up Claudius, and then we will call it a day. Claudius was the best emperor since Octavian. He greatly expanded the empire. He developed road and aqueduct services, presided over many civil and criminal trials, expanded the peace, respected the Senate, and returned some of the imperial provinces to Senate control. He married Agrippina. Big mistake. She had a son named Nero, whom Claudius adopted. Bad move. When Claudius and Agrippina became embittered with each other, Claudius leaned more toward his own son, Britannicus, becoming the next emperor. She didn't have anything to do with that, and she poisoned, probably, Claudius. And Britannicus was only 13 years old, and Nero was, I think, 17 years old when this happened, okay? And then Nero, bad Nero, would then become the next emperor of Rome. And you have to stay tuned till next week. When you're on video, I'll change shirts and stuff again, okay? But next week, we'll come back and we'll talk about Nero, and we'll wrap up, go through the year of the four emperors, end up with Vespasian, who was around when Jerusalem fell and Masada fell, and then we will wrap up our history of the intertestament period. And all of that, all these weeks of history are just a introduction to what's to come. Because you have to know the history to understand Pharisees and Sadducees and Sanhedrin and the temple and all these Roman and Jewish institutions that we're going to talk about in the next 5 chapters of the book. Okay? Who wants to finish up history today? Yay! We're going to do it. I know we can do it. I know we can. We're going to do it. All right. So last week we studied, who do we study? I'll go back to here. Octavian, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius, the first 4 emperors. Octavian rated really high on the impometer. Remember we introduced an impometer last week? Tiberius, pretty low on the impometer. He was not a good guy. He went off to Capri and did some horrible things. Caligula, pretty low on the impometer, really bad guy. And Claudius was okay. He was an okay guy. Rated pretty high on the impometer. So today we're going to start out with Nero. Guess where he rates on the impometer? Everyone's heard of Nero, right? No, he's red. He's bad. He's low on the impometer. Okay? So Nero was Claudius' stepson. And I'm going to show you a family tree of all this stuff here in just a minute. We'll get through this. I'll show you the Julio-Claudian family tree. Okay? So he was Claudius' stepson, was older than Britannicus, Claudius' blood son, who was 13 at the time. So we have a 17-year-old stepson and a 13-year-old actual son. Okay? Nero likely poisoned Britannicus in AD 55, one day before his 14th birthday. Not a good guy. This is 4 months after Claudius' death. Okay? He, Nero, had his mother killed in 59 AD. He brought back many of the evils of Caligula. He killed whoever he wanted to, basically. He executed his first wife. He killed his second wife by kicking her in the stomach when she was pregnant, and obviously killed the baby The question is, did Nero fiddle while Rome burned? That's kind of an old wives' tale, right? Did he fiddle while Rome burned? Well, that's the rumor, and it was promulgated by people who were not big fans of Nero. So the facts are that we know that fires were very common in the city during that time because of the way, we'll talk about in chapter 15, Life in Ancient Times, the insula, the Roman villages, the way they were constructed and stuff. So fires were very common back then. Nero was most likely out of town at his villa in Antium when it happened. The fiddle did not exist then. It was about 1,000 years later. And Nero was actually pretty good to the people after Rome burned. He opened his gardens to shelter the homeless, organized relief efforts. He may have played the lyre and sung, but only after the fire and not as the city was being destroyed. Many Romans blamed him, however, for the fires. So guess what? He, Nero, needed a scapegoat.
Christians.
We all know the rest of that story, right? Christians, that's right. They were considered a dissident group of Jews by Nero. And they were the scapegoats. And they were arrested and tortured, crucified, torn apart by wild animals, burned alive as torches, were covered in pitch and impaled, and burned alive to light Nero's gardens. It was the first state-sponsored persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. Paul, the apostle, was likely beheaded by Nero when he appealed to the emperor. I appealed to the emperor, remember, before the Herodians? Remember that story? We talked about that. When he appealed to the emperor, that was Nero, and he was likely beheaded by him. Peter, according to tradition, was executed by Nero by being crucified upside down. Nero was responsible for sending Vespasian to suppress the Galilean, the Judean revolt in AD 67. Nero's death, yay, couldn't come soon enough. In the spring of AD 68, Vindex started a rebellion against Nero, particularly with respect to taxation. So the Romans didn't like Nero any more than the Christians did, okay? Other provinces started revolting as well. Many threw their support behind a man named Galba. Galba didn't last too long either, but at least he lasted for a little bit. He was the governor of Hispania. The prefect of the Praetorian Guard also publicly supported Galba. Now, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard was a pretty big deal. That's like the head of your Secret Service going to the other side or something. You know, that's a pretty big deal. Nero fled from Rome, but he didn't have any friends. He was unable to support because no one supported him. He tried to board a ship. They said, no, not going to happen. He went back to Rome, went to a friend's house. He discovered that the palace guard had left him. In this friend's house, he discovered that the Senate had put out an order to capture him, and he would be sentenced to being flogged to death. Yeah, sounds like not a very good way to go. When he heard troops approaching, he convinced his secretary to help stab him in the throat. Before he did that, though, he tried to convince one of his friends to stab him himself first to provide an example for him. The friend declined. But he ended up stabbing himself in the throat. And he said, too late. Thought, what fidelity. What a guy. What a guy. And his death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty and ushered in the year of the four emperors. Okay, so let's talk about the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Now, last 2 weeks ago or so, we talked about the upper half of this chart. That's the Roman Republic. Julius Caesar's up there on the ceiling somewhere and kind of begat some of this progeny here. But the line of the Republic goes straight through Octavian. Octavian was the guy's name. Augustus was his title. The Republic on top, the Empire below. But this is the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Julio for Julius Caesar, Claudian for Tiberius. Tiberius was of the Claudian family. Julio-Claudian, that's who these progeny came from, all the way through Emperor number 5, Nero, that we just talked about. Now, remember that Caesar adopted Octavian. Now, you didn't have it last week because we were only looking at the top part of the chart, but down here you see adopted as a double line, children as a single line. So we see that double line there that Julius Caesar adopted Octavian. We see precedents then being set, and then Octavian adopted a bunch of other kids. How many sons did he have? Actual sons, by looking at that chart. I'll give you the answer, 0. That's right, 0 sons, okay? So he had to adopt sons. He did have a daughter, Julius Caesar, okay, but no sons, no blood sons. So he adopted a bunch. We see that precedence continue. Tiberius adopted a bunch of sons also. And we'll talk about what happened with Tiberius when he passed along the emperorship to somebody. Same thing with Claudius. Claudius was the only emperor that ruled of the Julio-Claudian dynasty that was not an adopted son. Wow. And you always think of the empire, the emperors being sons, sons of the last emperor or whatever. You think of kind of like kings today. You think of the king, the prince, it becomes the king and whatever. Okay, that wasn't the case here. They were all adopted except for Claudius. Okay, now let's go back and let's look at a couple of things. So we know that Octavian chose Tiberius. And he only did that, we talked about this a little bit last week, he only did this because everybody else died. Octavian just lived forever, he just would not die. He just would not die. So everybody had already, Agrippa already predeceased him, Agrippa Postumus, Lucius Caesar predeceased him, Gaius Caesar predeceased him, all these people. His general he wanted to pick, Agrippa, his general to succeed him, he died before Octavian did, and Tiberius was basically the last man standing. And then Tiberius, as we talked about last week, was a pretty sorry emperor. Okay, next up. Tiberius wanted to put in Gemellus, his grandson, as the emperor, but he was an idiot. Not Gemellus, Tiberius was an idiot. He said, I'm going to let the gods decide. Remember this story from last week? Okay, whoever's there first thing in the morning to greet me, I will make emperor. And Caligula was hungry that morning. He showed up, he beat Gemellus there, and Caligula became the next emperor. Bad move. Gemellus probably would have been had to have been a much better emperor than Caligula, surely. All right, next up, when Caligula was killed, we talked about this last week again, Claudius was taken off. He was grabbed by the Praetorians and taken off. People thought that he was being taken off to be executed, but he was actually taken off to be protected, and Claudius became the new emperor. Claudius became the new emperor under the help of Agrippa, Herod Agrippa. Remember that story? Okay. Herod was a good friend of Caligula, but he also was all in with Claudius. And Herod Agrippa was probably very likely one of the main reasons the empire continued to exist, because there's really a struggle between, are we going to go back to the Republic, or are we going to keep the empire up? But Claudius managed to convince everybody, along with Agrippa's help, that the empire should continue. Claudius, he was married to Agrippina the Younger, and they started having a falling out, and he really wanted Britannicus. He was more leaning toward Britannicus becoming his heir, okay, his actual son. But Agrippina the Younger didn't like that idea, and she probably, we don't know for sure, but she probably poisoned Claudius, okay, and installed Nero as the next emperor. He rates really low on the impometer, as we saw also. Okay, so that's the Julio-Claudian dynasty right there. Next up, number 1 in the year of the 4 emperors. He was only emperor for 7 months, from June to January. He came to the throne after the suicide of Nero with the support of the several legions and the Senate. He had support at the very beginning, but he squandered it. I mean, he was all in for himself. He had extreme taxation policies. He did not bribe his soldiers, as previous emperors had done. Several outlying provinces started to revolt, and then a man named Otho, Marcus Otho, one of Galba's early supporters, came on the scene and found favor with the Praetorian Guard, and then he was chosen to succeed Galba. And then Galba was beheaded on the streets of Rome by supporters of Otho. Okay? Very short 7 months. Next up, Otho. He was emperor for only 3 months in the year of 4 emperors. He ruled from January to April. He was initially a good friend of Nero until Nero took his wife, Sabina, who he killed later, she and her son, their son. And this made Otho and Nero not really like each other after that. When Nero killed himself, we talked about that, stabbed himself in the neck. Otho accompanied Galba to Rome to help Galba secure his position as emperor. As Galba's popularity waned, Otho won the support of the Praetorian Guard. Those were the ones who guarded the emperor. Okay, very important to have the support of the Praetorian Guard. He and the Praetorian Guard killed Galba on January 15th of 69. Unbeknownst to Otho at that time, though, was that several legions had declared their support for another man named Vitellius. They were in the process of marching to Rome to set him up as emperor. Well, Otho's forces met Vitellius' forces in northern Italy, and Otho's forces had a setback. I mean, they were defeated, but Otho still had plenty of men. But Otho rates high on the impometer down here because he decided to kill himself. And he said to his men, "It is far more just to perish one for all than many for one." That's a pretty good guy, right? I mean, he had plenty of legions still at his disposal. Okay? He could have probably defeated, maybe, I mean, we don't know, but he probably could have defeated the forces of Vitellius coming in, but he decided to kill himself and do the right thing, instead of plunging Rome into yet another civil war during this very short amount of time. So good on the impometer. We don't know much about him today, but now you know a little bit of the rest of the story for Otho. Next up, Vitellius, 3rd emperor in the year of the 4 emperors. He ruled for 8 months. As I just mentioned, he and Otho met, the forces met, and Otho committed suicide. Vitellius was a bad emperor, rates very low on the impometer. He was lazy, hedonistic, much like many of his predecessors. He brought all his troops into Rome, so the whole city became a large army camp, and they all started looting Rome. Not a good thing. Luckily for Rome, another guy named Titus Flavius Vespasian was in the works to become emperor. When Vitellius learned of Vespasian's plans, he decided to abdicate the throne to him, but the people never let word get to Vespasian. They decided to kill him instead. He was beheaded in the streets of Rome by supporters of Vespasian before Vespasian even arrived. Okay? Now the great guy, the good emperor, rates pretty high on the impometer, the fourth emperor in the year of the four emperors. He reigned for about 10 years or so. He was the first emperor of the Flavian Dynasty, and I'll show you a family tree of that on the next slide. He's the last of our emperors because really our history kind of lines up with him. When I wrote the book, I couldn't stop. I've told you this before. I just kept writing, and I went through the destruction of Jerusalem, and the destruction of Masada is a really good story too, as I kept writing until they fall on Masada. Okay? So as far as Roman history goes, if you line that up with the history that I wrote about, we end with Vespasian, okay, because he went to AD 79. So this goes through our history of Jerusalem falling, Masada falling, and pretty much the history of the New Testament, except for John living on the Isle of Patmos probably to about AD 100. He was the main general in the start of suppression of the Jewish revolt in AD 67 to 69. When Vespasian and his supporters heard of all the atrocities going back on in Rome under Vitellius, Josephus tells that Vespasian's supporters insisted he become emperor, and he refused. And the soldiers insisted, and he refused again. The soldiers then drew their swords and threatened to kill him if he did not become emperor, and Vespasian said, okay, I'll do it. I don't want you to kill me, I'll be emperor. Okay? Judea had the honor of becoming the region where Vespasian was first declared emperor. So you really have an overlap of declared emperors at this point, okay? As I talk about next to last bullet. The overlap in declared emperors from July 1st, AD 69, when Vespasian was declared emperor, to when Vitellius was finally beheaded on December 20th, okay, for a period of about 5 months or so. Vespasian, when he was declared emperor in Judea, he took Egypt. He marched on Egypt and made sure he had that under control because Egypt was the Roman Empire's breadbasket, okay? He also secured some other legions there. Legions throughout the regions started throwing in their support for Vespasian because Vitellius was such a bad guy. They knew he was low on the impometer, and they knew Vespasian was going to be high on the impometer, right? Right, yeah, okay. So, Vespasian sent Antonius Primus to Rome, his general, who defeated the forces of Vitellius on the way. And Vitellius, as I mentioned, was beheaded by Vespasian's men. And Vespasian was one of the few emperors that died of natural causes, and he had a sense of humor. He said when he was dying, he said, "Dear me, I must be turning into a god." We're going to talk about the divinity of the Roman emperors, okay? And how that was a conflict with, as far as the Romans were concerned, and how it was a conflict with Christians. The Romans had every kind of god imaginable. They would conquer somebody, and they'd conquer the Gauls, and they'd say, "Gauls, bring us your gods. We're good. We'll put your gods in with our gods." They would conquer the Britons. They'd say, "Bring us your gods. We'll put them in there too." So the Romans had all these gods, gods upon gods upon gods, but the Jews and the Christians had how many gods? One. That's a problem. If you're a Christian and you don't bow down to the divine emperor, that's a problem. We'll talk about that in chapter 15, I think it is, Life of the Time. Okay? All right. So the Flavian dynasty, we see Vespasian was emperor number 9, Roman numeral 9. Titus, his son, was emperor number 10. Remember, Titus is the one that finally conquered Jerusalem in AD 70. Jerusalem fell under him. And then Domitian, Vespasian's second son, was emperor number 11. And you see kind of how everything lines up there. Now, you've heard of the 12 Caesars. The 12 Caesars is a work done by Gaius Antonius Tranquillus. He was the personal secretary of the Emperor Hadrian, the Roman Emperor Hadrian. He wrote a set of biographies at 121 AD called the 12 Caesars. And if you hear this term, it's a little bit of a misnomer because the 12 Caesars that he's writing about are Julius Caesar, who was not an emperor, and the first 11 emperors, okay? The ones we have right here through Domitian, okay? So the 12 Caesars, if you hear that term, as far as this guy who wrote this work, okay, it's Julius Caesar and the first 11 emperors through Domitian. All right. So let's back up and talk about the Roman Empire as far as how it affected Jesus. When Jesus was born, Augustus, Octavian, was emperor. Okay? The Roman Senate was a puppet senate, basically, but they still exist. Remember, he kept up the appearances of the republic. Okay? The two consuls were Balbus and Vitus, and the governor of Syria was Varus. Okay? And we've talked about Varus before through our history a little bit here and there. He was the trial of one of Herod's kids. And then Herod the Great was the client king. Who here had imperium? So Caesar Augustus certainly did. The two consuls did. Varus had imperium. Herod the Great did not. He was client king. Okay, they didn't have imperium, but he had control over non-Romans. It's my understanding of things, at least. He had control over non-Romans, and he could kill pretty much anyone he wanted. But when it came to a Roman citizen, you had to be careful. You needed to have imperium to be able to do that. So that's the organization when Jesus was born. When Jesus died, low impometer guy Tiberius was in charge. He was the Roman emperor. We still see the Roman Senate, the two consuls, Vitellius and Longinus, and then Lamia was the governor of Syria, who Pontius Pilate answered to. Now, really, if I were doing this chart again, I'll change it to the book if I ever write the chart book or do an update to the book. Really, we'll add two other things to this. I'll add the other rulers of the regions. Remember that Herod chart that we looked at, where the prefects and the procurators took over the Judea, which is the combination of the three regions, okay, and then Herod's sons and grandsons started taking over the other regions. So I'll add these other two bullets under here whenever I do this. But that was the Roman Empire when Jesus died. Now, I talked about last week, 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, that Pilate, as a prefect, did not have imperium. So what gave him the right to kill Jesus? Okay. Well, Jesus was not a Roman citizen, for one thing. And I want to add one other thing to that, is that Lamia was kind of an absent governor. He was kind of a know-nothing, do-nothing governor. Okay. So Pilate, it seems to me, maybe had a little more free reign to do what he wanted to at the time. Okay, because of two things, because Jesus was not a Roman and Lamia was kind of a know-nothing, do-nothing kind of governor, best I can tell. Okay? Now, what does the Roman Empire look like? Well, it looks like this. In AD 73, they pretty much controlled the entire Mediterranean, all the way out Hispania, all the way up into the British Isles. They controlled a lot of territory, down into Egypt, of course, after Octavian took over and defeated Antony and Cleopatra. If we impose upon that the Christianity and how it spread, we see that Christianity by the end of the first century AD is the two colors, and the colors are not very good here, but these two lighter orangey-ish colors is in the extent of Christianity by the end of the first century, and the dotted line is the extent of Christianity by the end of the second century. And this is a little bit notional because we don't know exactly where Christianity spread, but it's kind of a good indication of where Christianity was by the end of the second century AD. Okay. All right. Whew! Is that how you spell whew? Yes. Okay, yay. All right. That's a wrap. That's chapters 1 through 11, and that's all the history. Yay! And then some, okay? Because we went beyond up to AD 73. Chapters 1 through 11, history. Chapters 12 through 16 are now going to be easy for us because we know all the basis for all the stuff that's coming up in chapters 12 through 16. Easy peasy from now on. The hard test is today. Everybody got your pencils? Okay.